Hello, welcome to today's sociocultural screencast. Focus is on 20th century Britain and the social and cultural factors that shape participation in this time period. Now, I'll put onto here, this is quite an interesting time period with regard to sports participation. So we have a look across here. We've got our normal social and cultural factors that come down here, and I think it's just worth having a look back into this. So if you look here, we think post-1850 Britain we've just looked at. Okay, we had a look at this kind of quite complex period when you've got post-1850 Britain, where there was times were still pretty tough with regard to time, income, and things like that for the working class. And then this last period here, things started to change better. Now, what happens as you get into 20th century Britain? This period from 1870, when we started to have the Saturday Half-Day Act, there was a 56-hour working week rather than a 72-hour working week. All these things, there's more disposable income. This stuff, all of these social and cultural factors kind of stayed the same from 1870 up to about 1950. And the reason for this is because there were two world wars in this period here. So things pretty much stayed the same. And then once you get past this point, things started to change a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is give you an overview of those changes, and we'll have a look. A lot of the stuff doesn't change, certainly down from class, law and order, gender, education, and then when we get down, a bit of education, and then when you get down to here, we'll start to look at some modern changes in the last part of the 20th century. Okay, so let's have a look. First up then. So first slide is really straightforward. And I suppose the first thing I should say is that actually, if you look at this, in the 20th century Britain, you've got to think that this is only, the latter part of it is only like 25, 30 years ago when you get to 1990. And you look at it from here. In this later part of the 20th century, the later part of the 1900s, social class, the lines between classes were not as rigid, okay? So the social classes started to become blurred a little bit. It wasn't as distinct as upper, middle, lower working class. It wasn't direct lines there. But the point we've got to know is that actually, when it comes to influencing participations and activities that the lower class people did or classes did, it still had an impact. So all you have to know is that basically social class, although it was less distinct, it still influenced activities. So if we have a look at that, still a three-class society, and it would still influence activities even though the class lines weren't as rigid. So if we look from here, upper class would still do activities like hunting, really good one to use. Middle class would do activities such as rugby union and golf. This started to become more and more popular for middle class. And then on top of this, you had lower class doing activities such as association football or rugby league, which is the professional version or the early professional version of rugby that took place in the north. So, of England, that is. So go down from there. Once we know this, so we look at what I said before. Post-1850 industrial Britain, we knew that was a free-class society. Activities still dictated by class. For you, it pretty much stays the same. So from here, your next section down. Amateurism and professionalism. Again, pretty much stays the same. Now, what people will say is, the class that you're in had less influence on being an amateur or professional. But amateur activities such as rugby union were still played by middle class people, and lower class professional activities were linked to things like football. So if you go down here, it was less dictated by class, but of course amateur sports such as rugby union was still played by the middle class, and on top of that, professional sports were still played by the lower or working classes, for example, association football or things like boxing. Okay, so they're the type of things we'd have a look at there. Hopefully that makes sense. So I don't know, for those people who are extremely conscientious, you might just want to make a note down here when it's a social class. Lines or the lines between classes or distinction between social classes weren't as rigid, okay, but it still dictated activities, and social class had less of an influence on amateurism and professionalism, and you go it through from there. If you want to put that, I think you'll be fine. We've just put in the examples down here as we have done before. Obviously, you've still got the example of cricket. You could still use that because in 1900 to 1950, you'd still have these kind of gentlemen versus amateurs cricket games with people playing with different roles and changing rooms, etc. So going on from there, then I just want to put this section here. It's an interesting point. So when we go to do 21st century Britain, Britain, there's a period right at the end, if you've got rugby union as an example of an amateur sport, middle class, even middle-class sports such as rugby started to change by the end of this century. So it might be just an example there just to put in. 1995, which is still 20th century Britain, but obviously it's right at the end of it, was when rugby became professional. Okay, so law and order then. 20th century Britain. Now, what we can say is that we know from post-1850 industrial Britain, the police force, RSPCA, and organisations that increased law and order were there, stayed the same. Okay, so the key thing is now that, activities, law and order is definitely present in society, and now it's started to become prevalent in sport. So what we've got then is activities in general are, as we know from post-1850 Britain, less cruel, violent activities, and there's a move to more respectable activities. So, for example, how can we show this? So, although you might say boxing is violent, an example of how law and order improved in that would be using boxing gloves. Rugby, football, you had codes of conduct, written rule books. So this is an example of how laws were starting to become part of professional or indeed sport in society at this point. Now, if I went on from there, it's all very well saying this, but it's important that you just have the caveat at the end of this, just by knowing that although this is pretty similar to post-1850 industrial Britain, we know that we can keep it similar, less cruel, more respectable. Examples of some little developments in the 20th century, boxing gloves, codes of conduct in rugby football. This is early 1900s. And then if you say, but it's important to always have that little bit on you to know that law and order started to become, I suppose, stretched in sport when you talk about the 1970s and 80s, because it was a period of football hooliganism and also a period of doping starting to emerge in Eastern Bloc countries, in places like Russia, where they were using drugs in sport to really improve their performance. So if I put it onto here, if you could just make a note of this by saying that although this is all the case, okay, that's fine, exactly the same really as post-1850 industrial Britain. Some little examples there just to make sure we're in the 20th century, and then just have a little bit here, just footnote, just to make sure you do understand that in the latter part of this century there were some changes emerging. On top of that then, education and literacy. So what do we need to know about education and literacy? As always, we are thinking about education and literacy really with regard to the class system. So in this case we're thinking about, right, what about working class people? How has education and literacy changed? We know that in post-1850 industrial Britain there was the introduction of the Forster Education Act. Now there's a new Education Act in this time period, and that Education Act is the Butler Education Act in 1944. Do you need to know the date? No. You need to know that it is in the 20th century, so in the 1900s, and this Education Act changed quite a lot with regard to comprehensive schools. So if you were a working class, you will be going, or lower class, you'll be going to comprehensive schools, and this meant that this act made all school curriculums, they must have physical education or sport involved in them in some way. And the things that changed is that now there was a move to specialist PE teachers. There were playing fields as a part of this act, and gymnastics apparatus started to allow working class participation within an educational setting. So this act meant that PE was now part of the curriculum. And then the knock-on effects of that were these things here, which allow participation to increase. And of course, it's important for us to go down to here. Competitive sport was absolutely flourishing in public schools, as it was in post-1850 industrial Britain, or public schools in that period. But if we just put it onto here, competitive sport offered in public schools. So we're talking about that independent schools, if you want to bracket that, or what we would call now private schools. Okay, so this offered the middle and upper class opportunities to compete in competitive sport. Okay, so if that's that, let's have a look on to our next one now. So from here, gender. So first things first, let's just keep this simple. Gender equality, is there any? Now, what we know from post-1850 industrial Britain is that it was a male-dominated. Nothing changes, okay, in the first 50 years, from 1900 to 1950, maybe to 1975. Maybe you might even say for the whole century. It's a male-dominated society for participation and spectating, particularly with activities such as football, okay? So what does this mean? Okay, so for women, well, it's the same. So Victorian stereotypes continued for women, okay, where, they had to be ladylike, they were considered the weaker sex, like competitive or contact sports such as rugby were considered men's sports, and if you did take part in competitive sport as a woman, it was considered harmful to childbearing. Now, if we look at that from that point of view, this meant, what did it mean for participation? There were less opportunities for women to participate. And if you want to add this to it, the opportunities were limited in 1900 to 1950 because women were housewives, because men were at war. So the women just didn't have any time to take part in physical activities. But you can start to see that activities that were considered more ladylike, alongside this kind of Education Act, the Butler Education Act, gymnastics started to become popular because it was seen to link to these kind of Victorian ideals where women were ladylike. On top of this, activities such as tennis, as we know, that middle-class preserve of post-1850 industrial Britain, where women were allowed to play, but they had to wear clothing that was or shall we say, that covered them up, and it was often very uncomfortable. Now, I'll put this down here. 1975 was the year of the Sex Discrimination Act, which gave women more rights. However, really, I mean, if you look at Los Angeles 1984 was an example of the first Olympic Games that had a female full marathon that ran the same distance as males. So there's a couple of little points that started to show that women's rights within sport were getting better, but I'm sure you can see, you're looking at 70, 80 years within a century where pretty much women's participation was still limited due to these kind of Victorian stereotypes prevailing. So if that's pretty straightforward, what you would obviously be aware of is in 21st century Britain that we're in now, the amount of women you see taking part in sport on the TV, professional leagues, all that stuff. So when we go into the next century, the last century, we look at women's participation and opportunity has increased massively. Okay, so for this one, though, still relatively limited. Going on then. Last three. So if we look onto here then, we've got income, time and transport. And I would say this is something we can start. Now, if you remember when we looked at post-1850 industrial Britain, what we said with that is that 1850 to 1870, there was a lack of income, lack of time, lack of transport. But then when we got to 1870, 1875 up to 1900, income started to increase. Okay, we talked about some broken time payments, and these things are still happening. In 1900 to 1950, there were broken time payments, the start of professional football. All these things meant that there was more income available, there was more time available, there's a reduced working week. All these things are still relevant, and transport obviously improved. Now, what we have to do, I think, if we know that income improved, if we know that there was more time to take part, if we know there was transport via the railways in post-1850 industrial, what we have to do here is show that we understand additional developments towards the end of the 20th century. So what does that mean? Well, it means this, that if you're talking about income in 20th century Britain, disposable income available to participate. The same as we talked about before and spectate for the working class. Now, what I would like you to do is start to think about some examples where towards the end of the 20th century or the 1900s, you can give some specifics. So lower class people could now start to go to local authority gyms or municipal facilities. And this is talking about council run facilities and parks. These were examples of things after the war that people started to use in the latter part of the 20th century. On top of that, if you said, however, there was even more income for the upper class and lower class, and middle class, and this was led to slightly different activities. For example, private health clubs and activities such as skiing. Going on to time, okay, so time then. Time to participate, spectate for working class. There was time, okay, so activities we can keep the same as post-1850 industrial Britain. Things like football and darts. Darts, because pub was really a central focus for the working class person in Britain, certainly in the 1900s to 1950. So that puts a bit of both there. And then there was even more time for the upper class. And what did this mean for them? Well, upper and middle class, this meant they could do activities that would use more time. And we use hunting. This has stayed the same through all of our answers. So we can talk about hunting here. But then we've got this idea of middle class people playing golf because they had the time to play it. The final thing then is transport. Post-1850 industrial Britain, we know the railways meant that people could now travel to spectate, and for the lucky few who participated in factory teams, they could actually start to take part in activities across the country. And what it meant in the end of the 20th century was that more people started to own cars, particularly the working class. And this meant that lower class people could travel to football fixtures, for example, if they were playing in local leagues or regional leagues. And also they could travel to local authority gyms. And then on top of this, as always, the upper and middle class had it slightly better. Cheap flights meant that they could now go to ski trips